welcome everybody. It's seems like it's been a while since we've done a webinar. Pretty excited tonight because what we're talking about is we spent a better part of a year and a half not being able to do the things we love, and all of a sudden, it seems like everybody's being shot out of a cannon and can't wait to get back to the water. And the idea for this came. Somebody recently said to me, I went back and I started rowing and my back is killing me. Do you have any ideas why? And I was like, well, I'll bet you I could narrow it down really fast. Are you doing 6 days a week right off the bat? And they're like, yes. And I said, well, there we go. Having you guys on, we can cover a lot of bases here. We can talk about volume. We can talk about rest and nutrition and recovery. We can talk, there's so many things that we can talk about. So what I want to do is get right into it and turn it over to you two to lead the way. And Will, you're going to handle the slides, right? For those of you who don't know, and I think almost all of you do know Liz Fusco and Will Ruth, we have a slide that has, there we go. Look at all those letters and titles and degrees. My brain hurts just looking at it. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys. So welcome and thank you so much for doing this. And I think a lot of this is utilized for multiple aspects of our rowing community, but tonight we're going to focus from the perspective of masters and see if we can give some great advice. So welcome to you both and thanks for giving us your time.
Thanks for having us. Liz, why don't you start?
Sure. So I did my bachelor's at the University of Rhode Island and studied dietetics and movement science, kinesiology, and then did a concurrent master's program in nutrition and exercise physiology. That's where I started working within the Olympic movement, and then worked with several endurance sports leading up to the Rio 2016 Olympic Games. Following that, took a full-time position with US Rowing. And throughout the pandemic, I had a brief period, a hiatus of sorts. Our organization went through a lot of changes with the pandemic and restructuring, and I came back on staff full-time in January. So I'm really excited to get a lot of things done and to prepare our athletes to go to Tokyo in a few short months.
Nice. And hi, everybody. I'm Will Ruth. I rowed in high school, thought I left the sport behind when I went to college at Western Washington University, but ended up coming back via the weight room. I did my degree in kinesiology and then spent a lot of time in strength conditioning after that. Stayed at Western for 5 years, more after I graduated, including coaching on water. And then my wife got a job out here with the state of Vermont 2 years ago. We made the move. Now I'm an hour south of the Craftsbury Sculling Center and get to go up there and coach their sculling camps, hoping. Got the first year in for 2019, and now we're just ready to get back on the water. We're as ready as you all are to get back on the water too. So here's some of what we're going to talk about today. But the basic idea is just the big picture as far as getting back to rowing safely and effectively from both the rowing training side and the strength training side. And then it's great to have Liz here too to cover the nutrition, hydration, support side. Some of you may remember that I presented on this last year in May, but we didn't have Liz then. So, and this is also different than it was in May because I think everybody has some experience with going through at least one of the return to train cycles. When I presented on this last year, I was kind of very concerned that people weren't gonna even recognize that there was a problem with it after 6 to 8 weeks of sort of the shutdown and everything being so new. So I spent a lot of time covering the research, laying out the problem for like, here's why we really need to pay attention to this phase of training. We're going to skip a lot of that today because I think people are pretty used to the idea by now. We're going to just focus on what do we actually do about it, and then making sure obviously that we've got plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So my part of the presentation covering the rowing and the strength training side is going to be really framed around this quote from the researchers who wrote the rowing injuries meta-analysis and research review. The largest factor for rowing injury remains rapid increases in training frequency, intensity, and/or volume. And the and/or is particularly important there because in rowing, those usually all come together. When we talk about frequency, we're talking about number of training sessions per week. When we talk about intensity, we're talking about how hard you're working, basically how close to 100% output you're working. And then volume is basically duration of training, so meters or minutes. In rowing, it gets kind of hard to separate all of those. So if you start training more often, then you're also training with higher volume. If you're training with higher volume, then okay, maybe you are just on the volume side, but you're probably getting the intensity work in there too. So that's going to be where I'm coming from mostly. Liz, why don't you frame things up for us?
Yeah, so I think you can look at some previous US rowing webinars, and some of them are on YouTube, many are on the website, and you can kind of see that there's some foundational nutrition information out there. I like to refer to the 5 R's of recovery as that. But in this presentation, I specifically wanted to target the most recent update on the IOC and ACSM's guidelines for athletes, nutrition for athletes. And there's some focus points in there that I think are really important. And I know that people who have heard me talk about nutrition before, especially for endurance athletes, have probably heard me say this, but I feel like this quote is really where contemporary sports nutrition is heading and how we can individualize nutrition for each athlete. So these days we talk about carbohydrate availability, which is the amount of carbohydrate an athlete's consuming in comparison to the fuel cost of what they're doing. You have to match up what you're eating with your requirements. And I think this can be a really tricky thing because as you're increasing volume, you're also, traveling more often, you're busy, you're moving. And I think remembering to eat and remembering to shift your eating patterns to meet increases in volume can be something that, may not always be remembered. So.
All right. So we obviously have a lot of experience with return to train phases in the last year, but just like Chris said, there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from this and apply it beyond just the present circumstances. So again, right now, really obvious example with returning to rowing from recently reopened boathouses and or gyms. So regardless of what's been happening before, here's where we are now. But in the regular times, this also applies. So anytime we're transitioning from relative inactivity back to routine training, or from non-routine training to routine training, that's considered a return to train phase. So we can talk about this with returning to injury. For those of us in the north, the transition between land and on water training when the water thaws again, and then any training camps or increased or phases of other increased training. So, hey, like we're changing something, the volume's going up, the frequency's going up, whatever it is. And if we make a significant change in technique or equipment. So again, just the shift between land training mostly on the erg to water training on the water is one. If you tend to row sweeps for most of the year and then you go into sculls, we want to just keep in mind that anytime we're making this significant change, things need time to catch up. We can't just throw ourselves straight into normal training without having some sort of adjustment. And then also new coaching staff or new athletes. So about first year and transfer here, which is more relevant for the younger crowd. But if you're starting in a new program or if a new coach is starting, that's also been identified in the research as being an area that we need to watch out for increased injuries and other factors. So this is a slide from my original presentation. I think just illustrates well why this is the case, that this all looks like rowing and we talk about it all under the big umbrella of rowing, but they're very different movements and different loads on the muscular and skeletal structures, particularly the spine, rib cage, and shoulders. And that's where we tend to see most of the injuries in rowing. And with masters rowing, that holds up as well. It tends to be mostly low back, fewer rib injuries, but they can still happen. And this is part of why that, like the intro slide said, the largest risk factor is rapid increase in frequency, intensity, and volume. These increases often happen during return to train phases. And even if you've been erging for the last weeks, months, or year since the pandemic started, you might be as strong and as fit as ever. But if your muscular and skeletal structures are not caught up and ready for this, then we can't be prepared for the same workload and the same level of performance in the on water environment. So the kind of the big why for why rapid increases and sudden changes cause injuries is just that rowing is a high intensity, full body repetitive motion sport. Injuries are overuse injuries, rarely traumatic or acute injuries. So that means that we have control over the mechanisms of injury, but basically one structure isn't up to the task. So over time, problems happen. Most often this is lumbar spine and ribs. Knees and shoulders are common sites as well. and we just basically applied too much load too quickly for the muscular and skeletal structures that need more time to catch up. And I think that one way that, well, we'll get into the various strategies here next. There are some additional concerns to be aware of too, and without wanting to turn this into a scared straight webinar, rowers and coaches should be aware of kind of some of the other health concerns that can happen beyond just injuries. Hold on here, I'm losing my screen. Sorry, hold on. Why do I have two screens in here? Sorry, I'm getting a weird split screen. What the heck?
I feel like this always
here we go.
happens at least one time during a
Well,
webinar. There has to be something.
How many of these have we done in the last year? And now here we are still fumbling around with screen sharing. Anyway, so here are some of the concerns that we're primarily worried about. And a lot of this information comes from a document that the National Strength and Conditioning Association put together after some very high profile NCAA player deaths and severe injuries. Most of the non-contact injuries in NCAA athletes happen during return to train phases. A lot of the training during this time is overseen by strength and conditioning coaches. And a lot of the traumatic injuries and player deaths have happened during these times too. So the NSCA, I'm thankful that they got together and put this document together for giving everybody some general guidelines. But the big takeaway from all of this is that these problems tend to not happen without a traumatic training stimulus in the first place. So if we just avoid taking our high intensity, full body repetitive exercise that now we're going to be doing in warmer weather and outdoor conditions, potentially now with detrained athletes as well, following a break away from routine training, if we just don't apply a traumatic training stimulus to all of that, we avoid a lot of these problems. So, yeah, I don't want to go too in depth here unless people have more questions on it. I did go more in depth in the original webinar back in May. Basically, in order for these to happen, it tends to be very extreme training situations. So like the last one with rhabdomyolysis is basically when a muscular area is exposed to such high trauma that the body says, hey, that's toxic, and starts breaking down skeletal muscular tissue and excreting it. One was like, I'm just looking at my notes here. University of Iowa football player fresh off of winter break, 100 squats at 50% of their 1 rep max in as little time as possible. That got 13 players hospitalized with rhabdomyolysis. A swimming coach brought a tough tester workout to athletes, 10 minutes straight of 60 seconds max reps on push-ups and bodyweight squats, followed by a swimming workout, and then repeated for 3 consecutive days. That put 7 athletes in the hospital with rhabdomyolysis. So again, like new athletes, new coach, return to train phase, and somebody with something to prove. So we just got to watch out for these things, and make sure that we are having gradual and progressive returns.
Chris, there's some interesting anecdotes from the early days of CrossFit before there was a lot of regulation, where there were quite a few examples of exertional rhabdo, to the point where they actually had, this is pretty dark, but they had a character called like Pukey the Clown that had a dialysis machine that it would like carry, and it was like on a squat rack. It was very, very dark CrossFit humor. And not a thing to joke with, because if you get, you can have renal failure from it. It can be extremely serious and deadly. And there's stories of people in nor'easter snowstorms, like shoveling their driveway for the first time, and they spend the whole day shoveling and they get rhabdo in their arms, or even like being crushed by things. So it's a lot of different things, but the heat illness thing is interesting.
Sudden traumatic.
Yeah. And the heat illness, especially because some of the places that you're rowing in are pretty warm and racing. So even Princeton is very hot and humid in summer. So
I don't have the Q&A pulled up with the chat. Are there any questions coming in so far as like general?
There is
the symptoms of rhabdo was one I just saw.
There we go. Hillary wanted to know, what are the symptoms of rhabdo?
I think it's largely like intense amounts of pain, particularly in one muscular area. So it's often it's also called compartment syndrome because the body basically compartmentalizes that muscular area, will sort of shut it down. So I gather that it's like extreme cramping. Yeah.
There can be some disfigurement to the muscle tissue. And one of the telltale signs is actually urine that's tea colored. So like when we talk about hydration in a little bit, I'll go through the different colors of urine, but it's literally like a black tea or a dark tea, because when the myoglobin, that color in muscle tissue comes out, the kidneys excrete it. So that's the kind of the biggest like thing that you would observe. Yeah.
I think a lot of times it is chalked up to just like extreme soreness, but then it's extreme
Yeah.
soreness that then results in all this other stuff and
Yeah.
doesn't go away because the body is cutting off that muscular area.
Right. And sometimes you can see in athletes that are in like in an overreaching, a non-functionally overreaching or overtrained state, you can actually see myoglobin show up in labs, sometimes in low levels. When you have rhabdo, it's like thousands, like the numbers are like usually off the charts. So
move on then, unless there's any more questions on that, sort of into the like, okay, what are we going to do about that? We know we've got a problem here. How are we going to solve this problem? And I think the first one is just the most obvious one. Identify when these return windows happen, and then use what we're going to talk about next to plan for them accordingly. So like my covered before, like we've got the obvious example right now. Let's learn from this and identify future ones as well. Coming back from vacation, coming back from injury or illness, sudden shifts in training style. We can also use assessments to get a gauge of where were you at before and where are you at now, and then how does this affect where we're going from there. So this can include mental and physical health, movement and mobility. You notice I do have erg testing here, but don't mistake this for 2K first day back, let's see who's serious sort of stuff. If you do really want to use an erg assessment to gauge fitness level, I think use something sub-maximal instead that still gives you the information that you want to get. How fit were you before? How fit are you now? How big is that gap that we need to progressively fill to get better? So just for one example of that, like the 30R20 test, 30 minutes at a 20 stroke rate per minute for meters is a popular test. You can just incorporate a heart rate cap with that and keep it sub-maximal so that athletes are not going above a certain exertion threshold. And then that still tells you a level of fitness. You could also do 15R20. You decrease the testing volume by 50%. And again, you don't risk applying that traumatic stimulus by throwing athletes straight into the fire right away. I've also used a 7-stroke or a 10-stroke test tube to be a power gauge to see if there's been muscular loss or power loss then. And that sort of gives us the whole picture of the sub-maximal fitness, the maximal strength and power without having to throw athletes straight in an all-out 1K, 2K, or other race pace. Liz, nutritional assessments?
Yeah. So once you're first getting back, a sports dietitian or a registered dietitian will go through, it's kind of an A through E, anthropometric. I think the important things to note about weight is that it fluctuates pretty significantly from day to day for some people, a lot throughout the day. So to measure it at the same time, preferably first thing in the morning, after you've gone to the bathroom, before eating anything, and doing it less often than daily, I think is helpful. Maybe weekly, just to see general patterns. I think that can be helpful. If you're weighing yourself more often, we'll get into this later as well, it can help with markers of hydration status, but it's not very helpful as a tool otherwise. And then I'm an anthropometrist. So one of the things that I do in my work with the athletes is body composition testing so that we can see an effect of a certain type of training or nutrition strategy on any types of changes in body composition. And of course, there's changes over the course of the year that are natural and normal. So it's normal to start in the fall in a different place than after a winter of higher volume training. Biochemical is kind of strictly lab information, which is important to get on an annual or more basis depending on the level of elite athlete that you are. Clinical involves more injuries, illnesses, GI issues, travel issues that are clinically related. And then dietary, pretty self-explanatory, and environment. So where do you live? Do you go to school? Are you commuting? That's kind of, the nuts and bolts of what the kind of key metrics for where you're at nutritionally, what a dietitian would use at this time of year, or in the fall as well.
Don't get too overwhelmed by all of these different things. It's not that we have to have this entire panel in order to be able to do a safe return to train phase. But it's just some helpful ideas for having an idea of where you were before, where you are now, and then where we need to go. So the more
and it's also, sorry, it's also like, think about some of these things, and like if there is an item on here that is potentially a challenge area for you, then approach your training with the understanding that exists and how to incorporate whatever the condition is into coming back into training.
And then we have some additional resources here too, just beyond kind of the basics. One that I think we have to at least acknowledge is for people who had COVID. The current recommendation is to get a 12 lead echocardiogram to know if there's been heart damage as a result of that. And we're still kind of figuring out what exactly that means for the athletic population, let alone the older adult athletic population. So just proceed cautiously, keep that in mind, see if we can get some medical advice on top of that. And then so we've got some other resources there too for that, but we're not going to go too into detail there. Chris.
As you mentioned, Tom has a question about gastro. Is reflux common among rowers, and how to mitigate?
I could give a whole webinar on that. Well, I think the simplest answer would be to, everyone's GI responds differently to different foods. So there are different types of diets that you can try around training. I think some of the more common triggers are acidic foods, higher fat foods, higher fiber foods, and more oily foods like greasy or fried or things like that. So if it's not something obvious like a cheeseburger before a session causing heartburn, then I would look at how complex your pre-exercise meal is. And I actually, if the Instagram takeover is still up, I talked about this a little bit yesterday in a US rowing Instagram takeover about simplifying the foods that you consume before your training session to ease the digestibility of them. And that way, when you're training, you don't have also digestion going on. It's kind of out in circulation and ready to be used as energy. That's my Reader's Digest answer.
Unintended. Okay, if everybody's ready to get into training, here's the basic rule for aerobic training, which you can apply for rowing, erging, whatever it is that you're transitioning back to, is to progress frequency or number of times, number of sessions per week that we're training, then volume, how much you're training within each session, and then intensity, how hard you're going within that time. So the NSCA has a 50, 30, 20, 10 rule. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the training from before the break that I've got here in the top column as far as total. You can use either meters or hours, and that's your 100% number. And then all the other numbers are calculated based on that. So what I've done before is we could take erging now. If you've been erging for the last few months, but you haven't been rowing, take the amount that you've been erging as a general weekly ballpark, and then take 50% of that, and that's your first rowing week. We can backfill that with familiar forms of training. So we don't want to be back in a detrain phase by going from 12 hours a week of erging to just 6 hours a week of training, period. We just want 6 hours of the new thing. So we'd have 6 hours basically of rowing, and then we'd either be back on the erg or doing other familiar cross training to close up the gap the rest of the way and maintain fitness. Then the next week we go up to 70%, the next week 80%, the next week 90%. It's important to know that these are from the NSCA for mostly targeted toward younger athletes to NCAA. So this is basically, I consider this the fastest that we would progress, but don't be afraid to take it slower. So if you've been away for longer, then maybe a 4-week progression becomes an 8-week progression. You could do 50% for 2 weeks, and then you could do 70% for 2 weeks, 80% for 2 weeks, 90% for 2 weeks before you're then back up to the 100% training volume. So that's just like the super quick rule that I think anybody can look at their training and be able to follow to give all of those muscular and skeletal structures time to catch up to the new form of training while you continue to push the former form of training until we basically hit that crossover point. Wanted to add here too, one of the resources that wasn't available to me last May and is available to us now is the World Rowing Task Force convened on the return to train picture. At first, all the guidance was very like medical focused. How are we stopping COVID spread? And I think that was all really important, but the concern is then after that, like, are we going to be into greater injury concerns and other concerns beyond COVID? Because we had people doing crazy stuff, rowing 8s with 2 people or 4 people at a time, whatever it was, to maintain social distancing and stuff. So, we're beyond all that now. But again, we can keep learning about this as we progress further. So here are some of their just key considerations. A lot of these that we've talked about already, and but this is just a helpful document. It's available for free and has a lot of other information there. And I think the big things are, again, just risk of injuries associated with the sharp increase in training load. We've got to be gradual and individually tailor this to how much training the athlete was doing before. Avoiding increases in volume of more than 10% per week. That's basically the same as the 50, 30, 20, 10 rule. Erging does not protect against injury because of the biomechanical differences compared to on-water rowing. We're going to talk about strength training more in a minute. And then I think that a great thing to do with your on-water time is to focus on the technical drills. And then you're restoring conditioning with your other training. So really working on getting up to speed with the rowing. And then gradually pushing the cardiovascular stuff outside.
Hey, Will.
Sport. Yeah.
Well, there's a question. How much would you back down if you've already screwed up the first 4 weeks by just hopping right back into it?
Well, that sort of depends a little bit on if you are screwed up as a result of the screw up. So if you've suffered an injury or something during that time, often it's not as obvious as an injury too. It could just be a plateau because the recovery is outpacing the training. So it's possible you'll pick something up here from Liz in the support sections that you could do to increase your recovery from training. Or if you're just able to like take note of where you're at now, and if you just need to hold it there or make a small change back down. I wouldn't necessarily go for like a full restart because you made it this far, 4 weeks. But I would consider other strategies to not just continue increasing from here.
And Liz, we right in the beginning, you were mentioning, as you're going to increase this activity and you're going to increase your training, you have to do things that are increase. You have to increase your carbohydrate. You have to increase your intake and make sure that you're making sure that you're balancing. Yeah, you're doing more, but are you setting your body up to be able to do more?
Yeah. Did you have a question? Sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, actually, this is probably the next slide I should have known, right?
This is the perfect segue.
Well, no, I thought it was really cool how you talked about focusing on technical drills right now, because that's kind of what the nutrition focus should be right now too. But we call it your nutrition foundation, but it's technical drills of eating for performance. Right. So getting back to the ACSM position paper that I wanted to talk a little more about, there's some key themes in there. One of them, which I purposefully left out, maybe we can have another webinar someday about supplements, but just know that most of them don't work. Some of them do and can if they are third-party tested, if they are safe, if they've been tested in training many times. but supplements don't work without nutrition. So that's why I'm not going to talk about them today, because we're not talking about supplements. So some of the kind of key themes about contemporary sports nutrition strategies that apply to everyone is that they're not static. You know, Will was talking about the 50-30-20-10 rule, and think about, as that's changing, should your energy intake remain the same? And if it does, is that putting you at a greater risk for injury? The evidence tells us that it is. Nutrition should be personalized. You know, someone's already asked a question about reflux. Maybe there's specific foods that one person can tolerate before a training session that someone else can't. Different body sizes require different volumes of food before training sessions, different variations of length of time, you know, all of those things. The practical challenges: are you driving to a boathouse, or are you docked, you know, in your backyard? Those are going to be different scenarios for eating. I also think a lot of people have been working from home, so it's making this an actually really interesting and potentially a positive time to put forth some changes in nutrition habits that can really help with performance, which is the third theme. You know, the goal of sports nutrition is to provide really truly adequate substrate to meet the fuel demands of racing and to optimize cognitive function, not just racing, but during training, so that we can have optimal adaptations from training. And that really gets down to energy availability. This is foundational. This is really what my kind of 5 R's of recovery nutrition talk is all about as well. And it's just that idea that your intake needs to be related to your output. Body composition, something that we can't be naive not to talk about. We know that it's important, but we also know that there are a lot of challenges that are presented in trying to change our body composition. And so we need to understand that preserving long-term health is the most important thing, also in preserving performance in the long term. Another big change that's happened in the last several years is that rather than talking about percent of total energy that a certain macronutrient like protein is giving us, the percent total calories, we actually make our recommendations based off of body weight, and even you know, if we have the information, off of muscle mass. So really starting to truly individualize sports nutrition. And then in competition, in a competition setting, the goal again is to reduce or delay fatigue, but the kicker here is to consider the event, the environment, and the individual. So how hot is it? You know, how long is your warm up? All of these things. And we work with strength and conditioning and the coaches to kind of figure that out. And then carbohydrates. I mean, I think you've kind of probably gathered that that's a big theme here. But some of the more recent research has shown us that there's a neural mechanism with carbohydrates, so that even having some in your oral cavity around before a race may improve performance in shorter events. So we knew that they were essential for endurance exercises longer than 60 to 75 minutes. But now we're starting to see some research that even small amounts of carbohydrate for shorter events can help too. So going into the idea of energy availability, we have the next slide here, our athlete plates. And this kind of pulls a lot of these concepts together. So you can find them at the link below. The first plate is if you're doing, let's say, maybe one session of strength training or a low intensity session on the water that's, let's say, less than 80 minutes total. And it's just one training session a day, around an hour, low intensity, low heart rate, or no training. That's what this plate might look like. The moderate training plate is often what I use as a baseline for anyone that's doing a morning row that's 2 hours long. That pretty much puts that categorizes as the moderate training plate here. And these were developed in partnership with the USOPC and the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, and they're validated as well. So we can kind of put our trust behind these plates here. So where we use body weight as a metric, we like to try not to be too prescriptive with exact amounts of food, because these plates kind of help to represent that. And I think a couple things I want to point out. The first thing you might notice is that the protein category here isn't changing with the different volumes of training. And the increase in training volume has caused the like carbohydrate section of the plate to be shifted from a whole grain to just a grain. And that's kind of the idea of wanting to consume foods that are easily digested within an hour or two before training sessions, to minimize GI distress. And if you're training in the afternoons, or maybe you're training early in the morning, you have to eat something beforehand, or even after work in the evening, you know, all of these things require fueling before. So how do we make that work?
And the basic idea there is, right, like blood goes to the stomach to help with the digestion process. And if it's around the stomach, then it's not helping your muscles.
Exactly. And then you can have cramping, and you can have all sorts of issues from that.
So the simpler that we can make the inputs, the easier it can get to the outputs to then sustain the muscular effort.
Right. And the more volume we do, the more important it becomes to have more around the times that we're training.
I think it's a hard thing about rowing too, is that it's very calorie intensive. And
Yeah.
if we're not fueling adequately to meet the demands of training, then yeah, that 50, 30, 20, 10 progression is going to be a lot harder as the training ramps back up.
Yes, exactly. Because the human body is amazing. Let's face it, it can handle it for a little while, but it tends to backfire pretty hardcore, you know, if we're not supporting it. So this plate here is what it would look like if you had 2 sessions in a day. I saw someone ask about 90 minutes of low intensity. That's a really good question. If it's a lower intensity, but it's going a little more than an hour, I mean, honestly, you can trust your appetite, and you should. If you're eating every 3 to 4 hours and it's something balanced that has proteins and carbohydrates and some fats, then when you feel hunger, it means that you're hungry and you should eat. So in terms of that period of time, I usually say to toggle between an easy and a moderate plate. So maybe, you know, if that 90-minute row is first thing in the morning, you have your normal breakfast, maybe you add some carbohydrate to that breakfast in the form of like honey or something that's easily digestible and low in volume. And then after that 90-minute training session, you have your moderate athlete plate. And then you go about the rest of your day guided by your appetite. If you feel especially hungry at dinner, shift back to the moderate plate. If you feel satisfied and you spaced your meal timing out through the day, it can be an easy plate. And then the last thing I want to touch on while we're on this slide is the carbohydrate intake during exercise, because I think sometimes people actually are on the water for 2 hours. You know, that's like not entirely uncommon. So the basic take home thing from this is have carbohydrate in the boat with you. It doesn't have to be a sports food. It can be if you want to use gels or chews or sports drink, that's totally fine. It can also be several dates, a banana, some clementines, a handful of dried cranberries, fruit leather. You know, there's a lot of things that we can use that aren't sports foods that would also get the job done. And think about it, you know, sometime around like 60 to 75 minutes into that row, that's where you want to, if you haven't had any carbohydrate yet, start thinking about taking it in.
Anything coming in the Q&A before we move to strength training next?
We did have a question here, Liz. Let's see here. I moved away from it. Liz, fasting has been used for centuries for spiritual and health benefits and weight loss, illnesses, and other benefits. Do you have any thoughts about intermittent fasting, especially for the master's athlete?
Yeah, I do. I think in my professional opinion that it's a potentially dangerous thing for the master's athlete to undertake while also undertaking a training program. The idea of energy availability is something that can protect muscle tissue, which is protective in age, and we're also, you know, dealing with, if you look back at a previous talk of mine, we're dealing with sarcopenia as we age, which is the loss of muscle over time. If we don't have adequate carbohydrate, then it can influence the metabolism of other things like iron. Our iron status can suffer. If we're not consuming enough energy, or calcium, then we can have resorption from bone. And this is a thing that occurs over a 24-hour period as well. So that's why we want to distribute our energy throughout the day rather than having it at just one time. And if you think about it from a very basic perspective, how the body might respond to regular feedings versus only one, and the type of response that the body would have to make in order to digest those things, I think it makes sense then why it might be not the most performance enhancing thing.
I think the words performance enhancing are key there, because a lot of this information doesn't come from rowing or endurance sports, right? That a lot of the body composition stuff is general health and fitness driven, and it's not accounting for people doing 1-2 more hours a day of a hard power endurance training activity.
Yeah, and rowers tend to be tall, muscular people with high energy requirements. So I think that there's definitely a conversation when it comes to why. If it's spiritual or a religious practice, then of course we will find a way to incorporate nutrition practices that are going to be favorable to that. And there are some really interesting studies in Ramadan fasting and the influence that doesn't have on changes in body composition. So it's what we're talking about is having an optimal performance in training and competition. And what we know is that is not how to accomplish that based on the past 80 years or so. It's kind of a young science, but
body composition can help with rowing performance. But for me as a strength coach, that's an off-season goal. That's not a race prep goal. We're not trying to do much in the way of gaining muscle or losing fat while we're also thinking meters, minutes, splits, race prep, staying on target. So I think that if that's a goal for you, I'd recommend picking that back up again in the fall or in the winter. Do it after nationals, do it after the Charles, whichever one's a meaningful one for you. Set aside 12 to 16 weeks and make that your body composition focus time. On the training side and on the nutrition side, and then when it's time to flip the script to performance, then focus on that and fuel yourself adequately for the performance.
And I'll also say that it is possible to change your body composition while fueling yourself adequately. And oftentimes when you fuel yourself adequately, it just happens. It's called a set point. It's a very real thing. So you can look it up.
Environmental factors, weather's getting warmer, maybe not for me and Liz just yet, but for all of us soon. The big things we're thinking about, rowing being an outdoor activity, we're dealing with all of it. Sun exposure, heat, the biggest heat problems tend to come within the first week of the new environmental change, or if you've been switching from indoor training to doing outdoor training, and that's a big change. Big thing from a training side is planning rest breaks and adjusting your work to rest ratio if necessary. You can do this with your rowing training, with your erging training, with your strength training. If you need to change those times because of environmental factors, do it. Because this is all part of the reacclimation picture on the training side, and on the strength training side. So, and we've got, humidity is a factor as well. If you're traveling for races, conditions are different. So we need to know how to support our training and performance accordingly.
Yes. And speaking of which, this is a good time to lay a hydration foundation as well as a nutrition foundation. And the ultimate goal with hydration, to keep it simple, is when you start training, when you begin your training session, you're hydrated. So that means first thing in the morning, are you thirsty when you wake up? And if your weight is lighter, if you happen to weigh yourself that day and you weigh less, that might be an indication that you're underhydrated. And then the color of your urine. So that first morning void can be fairly telling of the past 24 hours of your hydration status. Once you wake up, go to the bathroom, then start hydrating, drinking fluids with foods, consuming water, foods that are high in water, incorporating foods that have some sodium when you have meals. And that can be things like spinach and leafy greens. Those things have salt as well. Soups, smoothies, dairy products have some electrolytes in them. Foods and fluids of all kinds can be hydrating. And the goal is to be using the bathroom roughly every 2 hours or so. If you're going to the bathroom more than once an hour and you don't have a prostate condition, and it's clear, then you're probably overhydrated. If you're going to the bathroom, it's been more than 3 hours and the volume's low and urine color is dark, then you're underhydrated. So you can kind of adjust your fluid intake accordingly. Your sweat rate is going to differ based on the environmental conditions, what types of clothing you're wearing, the volume that you're doing, how long you're out there. So how much fluid you need changes as well. One of the ways that you can check on this, especially when you're in an extreme environment like New Jersey in the afternoon in July or Tokyo, the goal is to minimize your sweat losses in a session to no more than 2 to 3% of your body weight. So you can, and I've had athletes do this, hop on a scale in a dry uni before rowing, and then when they get back off the water, real quick, towel off, change into a dry uni, hop on the scale after, and see the weight loss. That's essentially how much fluid you've lost, and you want to replace that by 1 to 1.5%. So something to think about there. The warmer it gets, the harder you're going. As you increase your volume, your requirements for fluids are going to be higher. And as you sweat more, your requirements for electrolytes also increase. That's a little bit dependent on the person. Some people just have a higher sodium concentration in their sweat than others. And you might notice that if you have crystals on your clothing or hat, things like that. And if that's you, then you may need to incorporate more sodium in order to absorb that fluid. So the last thing I'll say about hydration is not to chug the fluid, to space out your fluid intake over time rather than drinking it all at once tends to be better absorbed that way as well. A couple of other things to think about in extreme environments. Back on the carb conversation, there is a greater reliance on muscle glycogen and on anaerobic metabolism. So in a training scenario, understanding that you're going to rely more on muscle glycogen, so you should more aggressively fuel for any training sessions that are hot and humid or races that are, just understand that you want to be on top of your nutrition if that's a condition like someone just mentioned that it was going to be in the 90s in Florida. That's an adjustment period, and your body will adjust. You may start to sweat sooner. Your sweat rate may increase. You might sweat more. There may be a preservation effect of electrolytes as well. Your sweat concentration can decrease. And all of those adjustments are happening as you get back into volume. So, keeping an eye on that. And how I mentioned of weighing yourself before and after a session, you can actually use that information to calculate your sweat rate, which is extremely variable, whether you're inside, outside, morning, afternoon. So understanding your fluid loss, and then maybe even considering some cooling strategies if you are planning on being out in heat and humidity.
Anybody getting back into gyms and more formal strength training programs after either doing the pandemic home fitness routines or nothing at all because of various things. The big thing that we're trying to present on is that this is a big overlap period. So we've got the reopening picture, we've got the weather warming up picture, and we've got the race prep picture. And it's all coming together. We're going to add then strength training on top of that for some people. So we've got to be careful of a few things. One is there's going to be increased sensitivity or soreness with that new change. Strength training has what's called eccentric stress as the muscles lengthen under load, and that tends to cause more soreness than the all concentric stress of rowing. So that's just one of those things. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means that we have to plan for it. And I think we've got to be extra cautious if we are in this double return picture of returning to the boathouse or returning to erging, and also returning to strength training or different strength training than you've been doing for the last year. So same as with rowing, address deficits before targeting performance. So that's basically the same idea as like spend your time with the technique drills at first, just getting familiar with that movement again, rather than thinking like you've got to jack up the reps or the weight quickly to get back to muscular strength and power. Then I take the same path with first increasing frequency. So first we're going to get people up to just 2 to 3 sessions per week of strength training. Then we're going to start building the volume within those sessions. And then the last picture is intensity. So I have my little graph here just to demonstrate how I approach this. On the side is sort of like my own mental shorthand for like how I think about this. Week 1 is just getting back in the groove. All we're trying to do is move. I like to use RPE, or rate of perceived exertion, over here in the 5th column for intensity. It's a scale of 1 to 10. 10 is no reps left. That's maximal effort. So for the first week, we're going to be all in the 5 to 6 range. So things are feeling like it shouldn't even feel very hard, because we're just trying to get the movements back online, and refamiliarize the body to this new stress. Then in week 2, which again, this is as fast as I would go. You can go slower, but no sooner than week 2, then we'll add some volume to that session, still keeping the intensity down. Now we're just building up the body's ability to get through more work in that same amount of time. Then after that, we'll start to increase the loading. So we'll go from RPE 5 to 6 to RPE 6 to 7, just push it a little bit harder, but we're still leaving 3, 4 plus reps left in the tank at the end of each set. So always feeling like it's challenging, but very manageable. And then no sooner than week 4, we'll start adding load to that again. So again, we get the frequency back, then we start building the volume within the session. Then we keep the volume there while we build the frequency as well. And this is, again, the same idea of just avoiding creating that traumatic stimulus in the first place. So we're trying to gradually build to go beyond where we were before, not just rush to get right back to that same point. Supporting strength training.
Yes. So it's pretty straightforward with this. It's really about the timing. So when I say like lay that nutrition foundation of having meals and snacks every 3 to 4 hours, I actually love that I got the intermittent fasting question too, because I feel like I made this slide for you. I hope you enjoy it. So on the right side, we can talk a little bit about this. This is a study where they looked at different ways of consuming protein. So the pulsed intake being kind of the grazer scenario. I'm sure there's some of you out there who kind of snack throughout the day. And then the intermediate scenario being that kind of structured every 3 hours, having 20 grams of protein. And then the third scenario would be kind of the intermittent fasting scenario of a bolus, every 6 hours having protein. And so these subjects did a resistance training session, and they consumed protein either in the 8 times, 4 times, or twice. And what this study showed us was that 20 grams of whey consumed every 3 hours was superior to pulse or bolus in stimulating muscle protein synthesis throughout the day. So the timing and distribution is a key factor in, again, maximally stimulating rates of muscle protein synthesis. So the question isn't whether or not you can undergo the training if it's not optimized. The question is, what do we want to do right now as we're getting back into rowing? We want to optimize the training so that we can optimize the performance. And that's kind of where this approach comes into play.
Yeah, I just
Go
want
ahead.
to jump in because I'm really glad we're presenting on this together, because it really is
Yeah.
that the training is only as good as the recovery. If we can't recover from the training, we're not going to improve from it. So don't add a ton of training all at once, because you can't increase your recovery that much. But do also try to increase your recovery while gradually progressing the training, because that's how we can get back to this point.
Right. And if you're already eating every 3 to 4 hours and you know, 20, 30 grams of protein is pretty much everybody's amount. It's plus or minus. Maybe some people it's 15, maybe some people it's 28, whatever. But it's kind of using that as the foundational base of your meals and snacks, and then adding energy in the form of carbohydrates and using fats to help meet the demands. Because I know there are some masters athletes that are doing pretty intense training with high energy expenditures. And fats are helping you reduce inflammation. They're also helping you to meet your calorie needs. So, all of the macronutrients should be represented and distributed. So for endurance athletes, not trying to put on muscle mass, the recommendation is around 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilo of body weight per day. If you're trying to put on muscle mass, then the range tends to be a little higher, somewhere around 2 to 2.5 grams per kilo per day. But you also need to be doing strength training that's focused on gaining, and whether that's like adding sessions. And I'm sure Will could talk more about hypertrophy-based training. But you need to have a stimulus in the form of training, and you also need to have a surplus of calories. So it's not just protein that you need in order to gain muscle. You need to have a little bit of extra calories there. And I think another point I want to make here is that protein intake is goals based. So for endurance athletes, it's goals based, but carbohydrate intake is volume based. And the range is a lot higher, 3 to 12 or more grams per kilo per day. So understanding that the protein's pretty consistent, the carbohydrate is shifting quite a bit as you're increasing volume. And then all the other things, colorful foods, healthy fats, functional foods, and herbs and spices to help to decrease exercise-induced muscle damage and inflammation as you're getting back into strength training and maybe feeling a little more sore than normal. There's no need to take any supplements to do this. I wouldn't recommend taking any anti-inflammatories unless a doctor recommends it because of an injury, but there are a lot of spices and foods and colorful foods that can help reduce inflammation without any of that other stuff.
And then our big wrap up slide. So from the rowing and the strength training side, remember, ergs don't float. They do not directly translate to performance or protect against injury when we go back to on water training. Don't do the shock and awe return of I'm going to just crush it and see how far we can take this. Do gradually progress, first frequency, then volume, then intensity. I like to recommend that people plan for a 1-to-1 away to return time. It's a little bit different with the shutdowns and the pandemic changing and stuff. But for somebody coming back from injury or illness, if you've been out for 2 weeks, I typically recommend thinking about 2 weeks to be back to full speed. That we're going to generally consider a 1-to-1 away to return time. And then remember everything that you're learning now for all the future opportunities in training, whether that's coming back from injury, illness, vacation, a change from land to water, et cetera. We can take the obvious reopening phase now and learn from it all the other times.
Yes, and on my side of the slide, a goal right now, a really important thing to do right now is to just build that foundation. Is there a period in the day where your nutrition might be on the back burner? Is there a period of 5-6 hours where you go without having something to eat? Or is it just a snack when it should be something that's more complete? How is it distributed through the day? And then thinking about the 5 R's. So rehydrating, all the fun things about hydration, repairing with protein, refueling with carbohydrate, reinforcing our immune function with colorful foods and fats, and then repeating this every 3 to 4 hours. Especially for those of you with GI complications, train that race nutrition. Your gut is an athletic organ. It's adaptable, tends to take 10 or 14 days to do so. So start simple and work your way up from there. And always focus when it comes to food on enjoying it, being satisfied by it, and incorporating flavor, because a lot of those flavorful spices and herbs actually have an anti-inflammatory benefit to them as well.
All right. Well, we have some questions here for you guys, as you can imagine. Concerns for rowers who are switching from sweep to sculling based on COVID. My club bought a bunch of singles, and we have rowers that A, have only erged since the fall of 2019, and B, never sculled. So what kind of common injuries should they be aware
Uh, Common injuries are pretty much going to be all the same as the usual rowing stuff. Low back pain first and foremost. Usually rib stress injuries are pretty related to doing a high training volume. That tends to be a little bit less of a concern, but can be given the technical differences between that big hug the horizon sculling position versus the to the side sweep position, or the straightforward erg position really doesn't get there at all. So there's not people often prop up sculling as like being healthier than sweeping, and it may be in some ways, but in terms of like injury incidents, they tend to be the same. So if you're training a ton or doing rapid increases, that's just as likely for injury either way. One that I think is particularly relevant for people getting into singles for the first time, and we deal with this all the time at Craftsbury with people who come out for the summer and they're super fit, but maybe they're not as comfortable in the single. You can't get a good workout in until you're technically proficient. So if we want to maintain fitness, we need to do so outside of the boat too. So you're still going to be doing cross training. You might still be doing erging while you catch up on the single until you're technically proficient enough to be able to push yourself in a single the way that you can in simpler forms of cardiovascular training.
Will, do you have any thoughts about core strength activities and flexibility? How should that be integrated in returning to training?
The same as any other strength training. So gradually at first. Don't do a whole ton all at once. Make yourself super sore. Throw a bunch of different movements in, and I think be especially careful when if you are combining in the true sense of like in the same session, because if you fatigue your core muscles and then you go on the water or on the erg and expect your core muscles to then support you through a whole rowing workout, you've just pre-fatigued that pretty crucial part. So other muscles, other skeletal structures are going to have to pick up the slack from those fatigued core muscles. So I typically recommend separating out strength training and erging or rowing, just because I am worried about the fatigue overlap between those two.
All right, switching gears a little bit. What if your sweat smells a little like ammonia on harder workouts?
Email me.
Yeah. You want to put your email in the in the window?
Yeah.
All right. So Liz is going to put her email in there, and let's see here. Is carbonated water, soda water, better or worse or the same as regular water for hydration?
Well, I like to start off with the group practice of detaching moral values to food or drink. So we can start there. So there's nothing wrong with it because it's delicious. I will say there's no difference in the hydrating properties of a carbonated beverage. I would be, I'm not a dentist, but I would be cautious about the total number that you're consuming in a day, because there is carbonic acid contained in soda waters that can degrade at your tooth enamel. So yeah, exercise caution in that sense, but it's equally as hydrating.
And Tom was wondering, and I think you might have covered this, what are examples of anti-inflammatory foods?
Oh, I love that one. A teaspoon of dried ginger or a tablespoon of fresh ginger. Most of the servings are about a teaspoon, but some of them vary. But cinnamon, garlic. I just learned recently that if you chop garlic and let it sit for 15 minutes, it activates an anti-inflammatory compound called allicin to a greater extent. So you could chop your garlic, let it sit for a while before you cook with it. Any types of like colorful things like turmeric, berries, dark leafy greens, all of them contain their own special phytochemicals and phytonutrients. So blueberries have stilbenoids. Rosemary has oleoresin, which reduces the formation of heterocyclic amines, which are a cancer-causing compound. It gets very complicated, but the bigger picture is the more colorful things that you consume, the more spices and things that you incorporate. Like I like to use ginger in smoothies, for example. or sauces, in fairly large amounts, so that you can kind of get that anti-inflammatory benefit from it.
Let's see here. All right. Switching gears again. Would you speak about post-COVID cardiac considerations? One of our masters rowers is having chest pains when rowing. He had COVID 6 weeks ago and he hasn't been hospitalized.
I am totally going to defer that to an actual medical professional. I know enough to know what I don't know, and I would try to get some actual medical advice. In the additional resources page, we do have the British Journal of Sports Medicine put out some medical driven post COVID return to train information. But yeah, basic idea is just like know what you're dealing with. So get the 12 lead ECG and then move from there with the advice of medical professionals. Liz, anything you want to add?
Yeah, actually, I don't have much to add. I agree with you completely. I worked at a cardiac rehab clinic in Houston, Texas when I was doing my studies. And I think they often did a type of ECG treadmill test where, just to make sure that the intensity that you're working at isn't creating any cardiac arrhythmias or abnormalities. So I think it's important to get that checked on, and definitely defer to a medical professional as well.
That's great advice for sure. We are out of questions. I'm sure right now, I mean, if we wait a second, we'll get 30. But I wanted to thank you guys. You guys have been go-to for the whole COVID, window that we've had, and it's been a blessing to have you guys around. Those of you that are listening, Liz did put her email in there if you want to reach out to her. Will, you'll find Will at Rowing Stronger. Will, if you want, I don't know if you put that in there. Carlos, did you have a question? I saw your hand just was raised. Or maybe that was an accident. But guys, thank you so much for tonight. This has been awesome, and a lot of little things to pick up and learn to ease our way back into kicking our own butts, I think. So, thank you guys for joining us.
Of course.
Thanks.
Happy
Thanks
training.
for having us. Yeah.
Oh, there's Will. Will's got the stuff right in there in the chat for you guys before I close it down. If you want to grab that link. Carlos doesn't see the email.
Wait, did I just send it to one person? Oh, I only sent it to the panelists.
Sent it to the panelist. Okay.
Oh, thank you.
We'll get that right out for you guys.
All panelists and attendees.
And, for those of you who are wondering, our US Rowing emails are usually our first name dot last name at usrowing.org. So that's usually the easiest way to get in touch with anybody who's an employee of US Rowing. So,
and good luck if you need to email Cam.
She's not wrong. She's not wrong, folks.
His last name is Casaglis, for anyone who doesn't know.
Not necessarily spelled the way it sounds. Especially with the way he says it. All right, guys. Well, have a great night over there in the great state of Vermont. And Liz, you referred to a couple of webinars tonight, so that means I have to call you and ask you to go Yale. Well, I got the Yale head on that. I was like, boy, that was random. All right, guys. Well, have a great night. Thanks so much for.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Take care.
Good night.